Greetings. In this video, what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time talking about Chapter 2, but I'm going to go outside of Chapter 2 and bring in some additional materials. But Chapter 2 is titled Cultural Development of Monsters, Demons, and Evil. And it's fascinating to really begin to think about this because you're studying evil on the one hand. Often serial killers and those that engage in mass murder and other crimes are referred to as monsters, and we also have a whole history of myths and beliefs and institutionalized systems that focus on the supernatural. Now, in no way am I going to evaluate religious doctrine or anything of that sort, but I do want to focus a little bit of our attention on some of the supernatural beliefs, aspects, and some of the features that could be related to crime and violence and serial murder. Books are bound all over the place. This is a very fascinating book, Vampires, Werewolves, and Demons, and the 20th century reports in the psychiatric literature. And we have lots of information in here about cases, and this is written by Richard Knoll and published by Brunner Mazel back in 1992. But what I have marked here is, the fascinating case of Dracula. Do you remember Dracula and werewolves? And it's interesting because maybe some of you are younger than I am and were brought up in a particular age when you were a child or adolescent, where you had very different exposure to movies, and for example, I remember when I think about Dracula, the Phantom of the Opera, the werewolf, and the like. I'm thinking about these 50s, 60s black and white films that I would see on TV back when I was a kid in the 70s. In the 60s and 70s, and they were very, very different. They were much, much, much less graphic. I think about some Alfred Hitchcock movies, perhaps. And then I start thinking about how we bring in this concept of evil and the devil, and I remember the original Exorcist, and the movie with Damien, the possessed child. And certainly the Exorcist, anyone who has seen that film remembers the little girl's head spinning around, and then projecting that green throw up, 20 feet onto the priest's head, and the words that she uttered of defamation of her family and the like. It was enough to really scare any child that might have seen that film. Interestingly enough, things have become much more graphic, but one thing that seems to have been going on for as long as we have historical record is our attraction to stories of violence, to stories about monsters, of demons, of angels, of UFOs, and the like. And of course, cults become an issue of discussion. It's an excellent book by Margaret Thaler Singer, Cults and Our Myths, The Continuing Fight Against Their Hidden Menace. And the foreword is by Robert J. Lifton, who's done some amazing work on genocide, terrorism, and cults, and this is published in 2003. And there's some information about the historical aspect of cults in your textbook. We could have a whole class on cults. It's such a large topic. And of course, vampires. This here is a very fascinating book, Vampire Forensics, The Uncovering the Origins of an Enduring Legend by Mark Collin Jenkins, National Geographic publication, came out in 2010. Kind of gives the history and everything, and many times you may not have photographs when it's more historical, but you do get some drawings and paintings, and you can see that as well, how monsters were depicted and the like. Think of Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, things of that nature. And then moving into our fascination, this book is really interesting. Jeffrey A. Kotler's The Lust for Blood, Why We Are Fascinated by Death, Murder, Horror, and Violence. And this was published in 2011 and Prometheus Books. Excellent book. And he asked that question. So I want to focus a little bit about a few items from his book. And he says that maybe perhaps we're curious about death and this danger and everything, because we want to know how to avoid it, how to prevent it from happening to us and others, and how to understand it. In another sense, we may desensitize the fear of death by observing it. Desensitization is something that can happen when you work in the field, and that's why I am able to eat while I look at autopsy photos or photos of murders or crime scenes. And many people, of course, I'm very sensitive and never look at violent depictions in public. Can you imagine if I'm sitting there at some burger joint and having French fries and ketchup and a grease burger and everything, and I'm looking at all these photos of death and destruction, and people probably think I'm a little bit deranged or something. How could he do that? And part of that would be desensitization. I try to purposely not mix my meals with my research and put that aside. But I've been doing this for so many years that you develop a different view, perhaps. And I discuss that in other videos on secondary traumatic stress and working in the field and the risks and dangers of working in the field. We also have a whole history in our tales and stories. Think of Little Red Riding Hood, and Professor Kotler points out that Little Red Riding Hood is this child story, which I know they made into a movie, which I did not see, although I did see the preview, and it looked pretty much like an adult-based movie rather than for children. That in that movie you have such themes as stalking, serial killing, rape, and torture, and cannibalism, and you think, what kind of story would that be to tell children? Well, a very popular one, obviously, Little Red Riding Hood. And a lot of this is for entertainment purposes, but there may be some underlying themes as well for our own attempt to understand and cope with death and anxiety and other related factors related to evil. And there's been a lot of new movies on monsters and aliens, zombies, vampires, witches, and the like. And all this has become entertainment. Obviously, if you work cases where you have situations that might be similar, it's obviously not entertainment, and you may have a very different view of these. I really try to avoid watching these horror flicks in the last probably 20 years of my work. But when I was a kid or an adolescent, we would go to the movie theater and see. I remember I went to see Dawn of the Dead, the original, with a couple male friends of mine, and they thought that it was the greatest thing that they could eat popcorn and laugh when the zombies got their heads and their arms hacked off, and almost a show of masculinity, that I'm so tough, watching this movie ain't gonna mess with my head. And I think that might be a theme we sometimes see as well when we get into this whole theme, and the interest people have in this. Serial killers, as you'll see, and you should read in your textbook, they have groupies like rock bands, and we might wonder, and there's actually some research on that. Hopefully we'll have some time to get into that later. What type of person becomes a serial killer groupie and wants to contact them and stay in touch with them and learn about them, or even marry them. Interesting features there. And I want you to think about how you make sense of that, and then think about what the research shows. Again, I mentioned Kotler's work is fascinating because it brings into play a lot of these questions. So I would encourage you to critically assess the myths, the fables, the tales, the movies, how the media depicts scenarios, what is shown, and how that's changed over time. If you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, try to think back of how things were 10, 15, 20 years ago. If you're in your 20s, perhaps ask someone who's in their 40s or 50s or older about these depictions and changes and how things were presented. And certainly we've seen a lot of changes. So this wraps up this video. Thank you.